The pain came like a hammer, sharp and unforgiving. It drove the breath from Ilara's lungs and buckled her knees in the dusty street of Providence Gulch. One hand went to her swollen belly, the other to the rough-hewn post of the mercantile. Caleb, her husband, did not turn. He kept walking toward the livery, his shoulders set with a finality that was colder than any winter wind. She had seen that look once before, when he'd put down a horse with a broken leg. A look of grim necessity, of a thing that had to be done, no matter the cost to another. He had pressed a few coins into her palm just moments before, his fingers brushing hers with a chilling absence of warmth. "This is all there is," he had said, his voice flat. He also gave her a folded paper, the deed to a patch of timberland his grandfather had won in a card game 50 years prior. It was a notoriously worthless plot, known for a single, monstrous redwood stump, so vast and rotten it was considered a blight on the landscape. "It's yours now," he'd added, as if bestowing a gift rather than an insult. He was heading for the gold fields in the west, unburdened by a wife, by the child she carried, by the life they had built from nothing. Another contraction seized her, a vice of fire clamping down on her back. She gasped, leaning her full weight against the post. A few townsfolk watched from across the street. Mr. Gable, the store owner, stood in his doorway, polishing an apple on his apron, his expression a mixture of pity and disapproval. Martha Davies, wife of the local rancher, hurried her children along, averting her eyes as if Ilara's predicament were a contagion. They had all heard the arguments, the shouting that had bled through the thin walls of their rented room for weeks. They had all seen Caleb's restlessness growing like a weed. Now they were witnesses to the conclusion. She had nothing. The coins in her hand amounted to less than $5. The deed was a joke, a final act of cruelty. The clothes she wore were thin and worn. Her only other possession was the life kicking inside her, a life that was now demanding its entrance into a world that had just been stripped bare. Mr. Gable finally crossed the street, his boots scuffing up clouds of ochre dust. "He's gone then, missus," he stated, not asked. Ilara straightened, her jaw tight against the next wave of pain. She looked at the man's face, at the comfortable certainty in his eyes. He expected tears. He expected her to collapse, to beg for charity, to become another ward of the church, another mouth for the town to grudgingly feed. "You'll need to find a place," he continued, his tone practical. "The Reverend might have room in the parish house for a time, for the baby's sake." The offer felt like a cage. It was a life of downward glances, of handed-down clothes and whispered judgments, a life of being the town's cautionary tale. Ilara's gaze drifted past him, toward the jagged line of the mountains that hemmed in the gulch. Caleb had gone west. She would go north, to the worthless land, to the rotten stump. The thought was madness, and she knew it, but it was a madness of her own choosing. "I'll need a good axe," she said, her voice raspy but firm. Mr. Gable's eyebrows shot up. "And a sharpening stone, a sack of flour, salt, and what seeds you have for a late planting." She held out the coins, "and a sturdy blanket." He stared at the money, then back at her face, a flicker of disbelief crossing his features. He saw no hysteria, no pleading. He saw only a terrifying, unreadable resolve. He took the coins, weighed them, and sighed. "As you wish, missus. It's your ruin." He turned and went back into his store, leaving her alone in the street, the setting sun casting her long shadow behind her, like a memory of the woman she used to be. She would not go to the parish. She would not be their charity. She would walk to her worthless inheritance and face whatever came next. The journey was a blur of pain and grim determination. The weight of the axe and the sack of supplies felt immense, pulling at muscles already strained by pregnancy. Each step sent a jolt through her body, and the contractions came closer now, fiercer. The dusty track that led out of Providence Gulch soon dissolved into a faint game trail, winding upward into the foothills. The air grew cooler, smelling of pine and damp earth. She was utterly alone. The world had shrunk to the path beneath her feet and the relentless rhythm of her own suffering. She walked for hours, long after the sun had dipped below the western peaks and the sky had bruised to a deep violet. A cold wind began to blow, carrying the promise of rain. She stumbled on, driven by a primal instinct to find shelter, any shelter, before the storm broke and the baby came. The trail crested a ridge, and there it was. It was worse than the stories. In the fading light, the stump was a dark colossus, a jagged crown of splintered wood rising from the earth. It was immense, easily 30 feet across, the remnant of a tree from a forgotten age. The wood was blackened and gnarled, and a great gaping hole opened in its side like a wound. It looked like a tombstone for a dead giant. This was her inheritance, a rotten, hollowed-out monster of a tree on a rocky, wind-swept slope. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over her. For a single, terrifying moment, she believed the town was right. She was a fool. She had traded a slow death of charity for a quick one of cold and exposure. Her knees gave way, and she sank to the ground, the sack of supplies falling beside her. Rain began to fall, first as a whisper, then as a cold, steady drumming. A powerful contraction ripped a cry from her throat. It was happening. Here, at the foot of this wooden ruin, her child was coming. She crawled, dragging the sack and the axe with her, toward the dark opening in the stump. The ground inside was a mess of damp, mulchy wood and dirt, but it was dry. The wind howled outside, but within the hollow, the air was eerily still. It was a dark, cavernous space, the curved walls of ancient wood rising up into blackness. It smelled of deep earth, of centuries of decay. She spread the new blanket on the driest patch of ground she could find, her body shaking with cold and the raw, unstoppable power of birth. There, in the absolute darkness, sheltered from the lashing rain by the husk of a dead tree, Ilara gave birth to her daughter. As the storm raged outside, a profound stillness settled within the stump. In the first gray light of dawn, holding the tiny, warm body of her daughter against her chest, Ilara looked at her surroundings. The despair of the previous night had been burned away by the ordeal, replaced by a strange, fierce clarity. She saw not just a rotten hollow, but walls. She heard the drip of water not as a sign of decay, but as a source. She felt the stillness of the air not as stagnation, but as insulation. The sheer thickness of the wood, 12 feet in places, was a fortress against the wind. The stump was not a tomb. It was a shelter, waiting to be claimed. This worthless place had a secret. Its very mass, the thing that made it an ugly blight, was its hidden advantage. It was a natural fortress, a home built by nature and time. The first days were a fever dream of survival. Ilara named the baby Luna, for she had been born by the light of a moon hidden behind storm clouds. Her world consisted of the few feet around the blanket where Luna slept. When the baby was quiet, Ilara worked. Her first task was to clear the interior. The floor was a thick layer of soft, punky wood and debris. Using the blade of the axe as a scraper, she began to dig. Her hands, soft from a life of mending and cooking, were raw and blistered within an hour. The pain was a constant, dull fire, but she ignored it. She scraped and clawed and shoveled the debris out of the opening with her bare hands, creating a pile that grew steadily outside. She discovered the stump was not just a hollow cylinder. The ancient root system had created natural chambers and alcoves in the earth beneath it, partially sheltered by the massive overhang of the stump itself. The interior was a cavern of wood and earth, far larger than it appeared from the outside. After a week of relentless labor, she had cleared a space roughly 15 feet in diameter, with a floor of hard-packed earth. The air was still damp, but the rain no longer pooled on the ground. She was living in a wooden cave. Next came fire. A home was not a home without a hearth. She needed stone, and the hillside was littered with it. She found a spot against the thickest part of the back wall and began to build. She chose flat, heavy stones, hauling them one by one from the slope. The work was brutal. Each stone was a dead weight that screamed in her shoulders and back. She had no mortar, so she had to find stones that fit together, stacking and balancing them with painstaking care. She used wet clay and moss from the shaded side of the stump to fill the gaps, a primitive mortar that she prayed would hold. For a chimney, she noticed a deep fissure running up the inside of the stump, a channel of ancient decay that led to a crack near the top. It was a natural flue. With a long pole, she cleared it of debris until she could see a sliver of daylight high above. When the hearth was a man's height and the chimney was clear, she laid her first fire. She used the driest splinters from the interior, shavings of wood she'd scraped from the walls. With her flint and steel, she struck a spark into a small nest of dried moss. It caught. A tiny flame flickered, then grew, catching the kindling. Smoke, thick and white, billowed into the chamber before finding the draft of the fissure. It curled upward and was drawn out of the stump. It worked. Ilara sat back on her heels, the warmth pushing back the perpetual damp chill for the first time. Tears she had refused to shed in town now streamed down her face, hissing on the warm stones of the hearth she had built. With warmth secured, her next focus was water. A steady seep trickled from the hillside a dozen yards from the stump. The water was clear and cold. To bring it closer, she spent 2 days digging a narrow channel, lining it with flat stones. Just inside the entrance to her new home, in one of the earthen alcoves, she dug a shallow basin. She remembered seeing potters in her old town use clay to line cisterns. The soil here was rich with it. She mixed the clay with water into a thick paste and plastered the inside of the basin, layer by layer, letting each one dry in the fire's warmth. When it was finished, she diverted the channel. Water trickled into her home and pooled in the clay-lined cistern. She had clean water on demand, sheltered from the elements. The $5 from Caleb were nearly gone. Her flour was dwindling. She needed more than just shelter. She needed a future. It was time to return to Providence Gulch. Leaving Luna sleeping, wrapped tightly in the blanket near the warm hearth, she took the axe and walked the long miles back to town. Her arrival caused a stir. She was thinner, harder. Her hands were calloused and crisscrossed with healing cuts. Her face was smudged with soot. She looked feral. She walked directly into Gable's Mercantile. The usual crowd of loafers fell silent. Mr. Gable stopped weighing a sack of beans and stared at her. "My God," he whispered, "you're alive." Ilara ignored him. She walked to the counter and pointed at the goods she needed. "I have work," she said, her voice clear. "I can chop firewood, mend clothes, clean. I need 2 laying hens, a small piglet, and as many vegetable seeds as this will buy." She placed 3 perfectly split, identical pieces of redwood kindling on the counter. It was rich, fragrant wood, the kind that burned hot and clean. Mr. Gable picked up a piece, weighing it in his hand. He looked at the clean cut of the axe, the uniform size. This was not the work of a desperate woman. It was the work of a woodsman. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice betraying a sliver of respect. "From my home," Elara replied. A man in the corner, a trapper named Brant, snorted. "You mean that rotten Stump? Heard you were living in a hole like a badger. We've been calling you the Stump Widow." Laughter trickled through the store. Elara's eyes did not waver from Mr. Gable's. She did not acknowledge the mockery. Her silence was more powerful than any retort. It made them uncomfortable. Mr. Gable cleared his throat. He saw a transaction, not a charity case. "All right," he said, nodding. "The wood is good. I'll give you credit." He gathered the seeds, and his boy went to fetch the hens and the piglet. As she left the store, a crate with 2 clucking chickens under one arm and a squirming piglet in a sack over her shoulder, she heard Brant's voice follow her. "Enjoy your palace, Your Majesty." The men roared with laughter. Elara did not look back. The journey home was harder, burdened by the squawking, wriggling life she now had to protect. Back at the stump, she built a small, sturdy pen for the piglet against the outer wall, using interlocking logs and stones. She fashioned a coop for the hens in another of the sheltered root alcoves. They were her future. They were eggs and meat. They were a promise. A week later, a scrawny, mud-caked dog appeared at the edge of the clearing, drawn by the smell of the pig. It was all ribs and fear, but its eyes were intelligent. Elara left out a bowl of water and a few scraps. The dog drank, but would not come closer. It watched her work, a silent, wary observer. She called him Moss, for his matted, greenish-brown coat. He never came close enough to touch, but he never left. He was her sentinel. Summer faded into a cool, crisp autumn. Elara's days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and her daughter's needs. She rose before dawn, tended the fire, fed the animals, worked on the stump. She used the axe to slowly, methodically hew the inside walls, making them smoother and more uniform. The chips and curls of fragrant redwood became her firewood stockpile, which grew into a massive, orderly stack against one wall. She built a proper door from planks split from a fallen pine, with leather hinges and a heavy wooden bar for a lock. She carved a small opening in the south-facing wall and, using a piece of translucent quartz she'd found, created a tiny, crude window that let in a sliver of afternoon light. Her garden, planted late on a patch of land she'd cleared with fire and axe, yielded a small but vital harvest of squash, beans, and hardy greens. She learned the art of preservation, drying beans and herbs from the high rafters of her home, storing squash in the coolest, darkest alcove. The first egg from her hens felt like a jewel in her palm. It was a miracle of food she had not begged for, a return on her investment of labor and will. The world of Providence Gulch, with its mockery and its pity, felt 1,000 miles away. Her world was here, in this fortress of wood and earth. The mockery did not cease. It became a kind of local folklore. Travelers were sometimes directed up the trail to see the Stump Widow's folly. One afternoon, Mr. Davies, the rancher whose land bordered her worthless plot, rode up. He was a big man with a florid face, who sat his horse like a king on a throne. He surveyed her small garden, the pig pen, the smoke curling from the top of the stump. "Well, I'll be," he drawled, a smirk playing on his lips. "You've made a right little hobbit hole for yourself." Elara was splitting firewood, the axe rising and falling with an efficient, powerful rhythm. She did not stop. She simply glanced up at him. "It keeps the rain out," she said, "and my daughter warm." Mr. Davies chuckled. "Winter's coming, girl. A real winter. This thing," he waved a dismissive hand at the stump, "it'll be your coffin. When the snows get deep and your fire goes out, you'll wish you'd taken the church's charity." He tipped his hat with mock gallantry. Don't come crying to me when you're freezing." He spurred his horse and rode away, satisfied. His visit was a harbinger. The first snows fell in late October, a light dusting that melted by noon. But they were a warning. Elara worked with a renewed urgency. She reinforced the animal pens, packed more clay and moss into every conceivable crack in her home. She spent days hauling fallen branches, adding to her firewood mountain until it nearly touched the ceiling. Moss, the dog, finally decided to trust her. During the first cold snap, he had crept inside and curled up as far from the fire as he could, shivering. Now he was a permanent resident, a furry, warm guardian who slept at the foot of her bed. Deep winter arrived. The world outside her stump became a landscape of white and gray. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the snow piled in drifts against her door. But inside, her world was one of order and warmth. The massive stone hearth, now heated day and night, had become a thermal battery. The stone absorbed the heat and radiated it back slowly, keeping the cavernous space at a constant, comfortable temperature. Even when the fire burned low at night, the air never grew truly cold. The thick wooden walls, packed with a century of dense fiber, were an insulator beyond compare. Her days were a simple, repeating loop. Wake, stoke the fire, milk the goat she had traded for in the autumn, feed the hens, the pig, check her stores, tend to Luna, who was now a healthy, crawling baby, mesmerized by the dancing flames. Carve, mend, cook, sleep. It was a solitary existence, but it was not lonely. She was the sovereign of her small, warm kingdom. One night, a pack of wolves, driven by hunger from the high country, circled the stump. Moss stood at the barred door, a low, rumbling growl in his chest. The wolves clawed at the thick wood, their howls echoing in the night. But they could find no purchase, no weakness. The stump was impregnable. In the morning, Elara found their tracks in the snow, a testament to the security she had built. Her systems had been tested. They held. The blizzard of '83 arrived not with a whisper, but with a roar. It began as a heavy snow in the morning, and by noon, the sky was a churning, white fury. The wind came from the north like a physical blow, a solid wall of force that ripped shingles from roofs and shattered windows. The temperature plummeted. It was a storm of a magnitude no one in Providence Gulch had ever seen. The old-timers had no stories for a cold this deep, a wind this savage. In town, chaos reigned. The first roof to go was the meeting hall's, its timbers cracking under a colossal weight of snow. Then the mercantile's porch sheared off with a sound like a cannon shot. Families huddled in their homes, stuffing rags into the cracks of their walls as the wind forced its way inside, a thief of warmth. Fireplaces, built for ordinary winters, devoured firewood at an impossible rate. By the second day, stockpiles were running low. The cold was a living thing, seeping through the floorboards, creeping down the chimneys. Livestock, left in barns that were little more than wooden shells, began to freeze to death where they stood. Inside the stump, Elara barely noticed the change. The wind's howl was a distant, muffled moan, unable to penetrate the 12-foot thick walls. The snow piled up, burying her home completely. But this only served to insulate it further. Her world became a silent, subterranean bubble of warmth and light. The fire in her massive stone hearth burned steadily. The great stack of redwood logs barely diminished. The goat and chickens were calm in their sheltered alcoves. The cistern was full. Luna played on a sheepskin rug, blissfully unaware of the white apocalypse raging just a few feet above her. Elara was not fighting the storm. she was simply outside its reach. The town was wrong. Their straight walls and neat roofs were fragile. Her ugly, organic fortress was absolute. On the third night of the blizzard, as Elara was singing a quiet lullaby to Luna, Moss shot to his feet. A deep growl vibrated in his chest, his eyes fixed on the barred door. Elara fell silent. Over the low hum of the fire she heard it, a faint, desperate banging from outside. It was impossible. No one could be out in this. The snow was deeper than a man was tall. The sound came again, weaker this time, a frantic scratching. She laid Luna in her small cot, took a burning brand from the fire for light, and pulled the heavy bar from the door. Pushing it open required all her strength. A wall of snow had packed against it. She shoved until a narrow opening was created, and a figure, caked in ice and snow, fell forward into the room, collapsing onto the earthen floor. It was a woman. As the snow melted from her face in the sudden warmth, Elara recognized her. It was Martha Davies, the rancher's wife. Her face was a mask of frozen tears, her lips blue. "Please," she gasped, her voice a raw whisper. "My son. He's sick. The fever. Our house. The roof fell in the back. We have no fire." She was shaking uncontrollably, her eyes wide with a terror that went beyond the cold. Here, at her door, was the wife of the man who had promised her a coffin of snow. Here was a woman who had looked away from her in the street. Elara looked from the desperate mother to her own sleeping child, warm and safe. She thought of her carefully rationed firewood, her precious stores of food. Helping would come at a cost, but the choice was not a choice at all. She had not built this fortress to hoard her survival. She had built it to live. And life, she knew, was not meant to be lived alone, gloating over the suffering of others. "Get by the fire," Elara said, her voice even. She helped the woman to her feet and sat her on the stone hearth, wrapping her in a thick wool blanket. "Where is your son?" "With my husband," Martha sobbed. "At the house. He couldn't carry him. The snow. I came for help." Elara made her decision in an instant. She banked the fire, checked on Luna, and pulled on her heaviest clothes. She grabbed a coil of rope and a small sled she had built for hauling firewood. "Stay here. Keep the fire. My dog will stay with you," she commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. Moss looked from her to the door, whining softly, but he obeyed, lying down near Martha and Luna. Elara tied the rope around her waist, secured the other end to the doorframe, and plunged into the white maelstrom. Outside was not a world. It was a formless, roaring chaos of wind and ice. The snow was a disorienting, suffocating blanket. She could see nothing. But she knew the direction of the Davies ranch. She had memorized the landscape, every ridge and gully. She moved by instinct, by the feel of the ground beneath her feet. The wind tore at her, trying to rip the breath from her lungs. The cold was a physical pain, 1,000 needles stabbing at her skin. The sled was useless in the deep powder. She abandoned it and pushed on, a lone, small figure battling an elemental fury. It felt like an eternity before she saw it, a faint, flickering light. The Davies ranch house was a ruin. A huge section of the roof had collapsed, and snow filled half the main room. In the one remaining corner, Mr. Davies huddled over a small fire built from smashed furniture, trying to shield a small, shivering bundle with his own body. He looked up as she appeared in the gaping hole where a wall used to be, a figure of snow and ice, seeming to materialize from the storm itself. His eyes, rimmed with frost and despair, widened in disbelief. He looked from her to his dying fire, to his sick child, and the arrogance that had defined him shattered. He saw not the foolish Stump widow, but a savior. Without a word, Ilara helped him wrap the boy in every remaining blanket, then took the child into her own arms. The journey back was a nightmare of shared will. Davies, his strength failing, held on to Ilara as she broke the trail, following the rope she had so wisely laid. They stumbled, fell, and rose again, two enemies united by the single purpose of saving a child. When they finally fell through the doorway of the stump, the sudden warmth and quiet was a physical shock. Mr. Davies stopped dead, his mouth agape. He stared. His wife was there, safe. And the place, it was not a hole. It was a home. A warm, dry, ordered space, filled with the smell of wood smoke and baking bread. A goat looked at him placidly from its clean pen. Chickens roosted quietly. A mountain of firewood was stacked neatly to the ceiling. In the center of it all, Ilara was unwrapping his son by the light of a steady, roaring fire, her movements calm and efficient. He saw the smooth-hewn walls, the stone hearth that glowed with heat, the shelves carved into the wood holding jars of preserved food, the cistern of clean water. He saw the baby sleeping peacefully in her cot. He looked at the wreckage of his own modern timber frame house, now a frozen tomb, and then at this ancient, living fortress. He had called her a fool. He had laughed at her. My God, he thought, we were the fools. Ilara examined the boy. The fever was high. She prepared a tea from willow bark, a remedy her grandmother had taught her. She bathed his face with cool water from the cistern. Martha watched, her hands clasped in prayer. Davies simply stood, dripping and shivering, his eyes darting around the room, unable to reconcile what he was seeing with the narrative he had held for so long. He had built his life on owning land, on bending nature to his will with fences and planks. This woman had done the opposite. She had listened to the land, found its strength, and settled into it. After a long while, as his son's breathing began to ease, Mr. Davies finally spoke. His voice was cracked and raw. "We were wrong," he said, the words torn from him. "We all were. We called you a fool." He looked at Ilara, his eyes filled with a shame so profound it was painful to witness. "We laughed." Ilara met his gaze. There was no triumph in her eyes, no satisfaction. There was only a deep, weary calm. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not remind him of his cruel words. She simply ladled a bowl of hot stew from the pot hanging over the fire and held it out to him. "There is food," she said. "Eat." The simple act of grace was more humbling than any rebuke. He took the bowl, his powerful hands trembling, and wept. When the blizzard finally broke after 5 days, the world was transformed and silent, buried under a deep blanket of white. The Davies family, their son now past the crisis, were the first survivors. But they were not the last. As news of the devastation in Providence Gulch trickled out from the few who could travel, the Stump became a beacon. Ilara sent Davies back to town, not empty-handed, but with a sled loaded with firewood and dried food. He became her emissary. People who had once mocked her now followed him back up the trail, their faces etched with desperation and awe. She took them in. Families whose homes were destroyed, men whose hands and feet were blackened with frostbite. Her home, the Stump Widow's Folly, became an ark. She shared her food, her warmth, her knowledge. She taught them how the massive hearth held heat, how the thick walls defeated the wind. They saw not a freak of nature, but a miracle of engineering and foresight. The nickname was retired. Some began to call her Ilara of the Stump, a title of respect, of legend. In the aftermath, Providence Gulch was a changed town. The Great Freeze had been a harsh teacher. They rebuilt, but they rebuilt differently. New homes were built with thicker walls, with stone foundations, and massive central hearths inspired by Ilara's design. People began to look at the landscape not as something to be conquered, but as something to be understood. The story of the woman who had built a home in a rotten stump spread far beyond the gulch, carried by travelers and traders. It became a frontier legend, a story of resilience that gave hope to people in other harsh and lonely places. Ilara never left her home. It grew with her. She expanded the interior, carving out new rooms, a workshop, a larger cellar for her stores. The land around it blossomed. She cultivated a terraced garden, built a small dam to create a pond, and her livestock herd grew. The stump was no longer just a shelter. It was the heart of a thriving homestead, a place of abundance and peace. The community, once her tormentor, was now her partner. They traded with her, sought her advice on all matters, from building to planting to surviving. Mr. Davies became her staunchest ally, ensuring her land was forever protected. Years later, a visitor to Providence Gulch might be shown the way up the old trail. They would find not a dark hole, but a remarkable home, its door open, smoke curling gently from the chimney. They might see a woman with silver in her hair, her hands still strong and capable, watching her daughter, and later her grandchildren, play in the sunlight. She had been given the worst of what the world had to offer: betrayal, abandonment, and a piece of land considered worthless. And from it, she had built everything. Her legacy was not written in laws or ledgers, but in stone and wood, and in the quiet, unshakable truth that the greatest strength is not the power to dominate, but the wisdom to endure.